Hi guys, this is chapter 1, the demand for auditing. Okay, so you might be interested to know that back in the 1920s, before audits became mandatory in the 1930s, public companies on the New York Stock Exchange, about 80% of them, still decided to purchase audits, even though they weren't mandatory. So why would that be? So that's kind of what we're talking about today. Where does this demand for auditing originate from in absence of regulation? All right, and so to understand this, we need to talk about the principal agent problem or agency theory. And basically, this problem arises whenever we have one party, an agent, who is supposed to act in the best interest of another party, a second party, a principal, rather than in his or her own best interests. We have lots of examples of this in the world outside of business, right? So think about a politician, right? They're supposed to be acting in the best interests of their constituents or citizens, but we know, right, that politicians also are looking out for their own best interests, right? They care about getting reelected. They care about getting donations to their campaigns, things like that. So we know they are trying to juggle. Hopefully, you know, the good politicians do care about what their constituents want, but you know, even the very best are probably juggling their own self-interests along with the best interests of the populace. And we also have the doctor, right? They're the agent versus the patient who's the principal. Right? So doctors, again, like they don't just need to act in the best interests of the patient, they're also worried about their own self-interests, how much they get paid, are they going to keep their job? You know, there might be issues with them trying to have relationships with pharmacy companies or insurance companies. So it's always going to be a balancing act when you have one person who's supposed to be acting in the best interest of another. Because they're always going to have to balance their own self-interests. And then finally, we get to the manager versus the investor stakeholders, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. So the manager is the agent in this case, and he's supposed to be acting in the best interests of the people that actually own the company, right? People that own the stock of the company. Okay, so let's think about different forms of business and the agency problems that exist with each. So when you start off a business, you own your own business, right? You're investing all your own personal capital, personal money into the business, and you also manage day-to-day operations of the business. In this case, because the manager and the owner are the same person, their best interests are perfectly aligned, right? So we have very few agency problems with this sole proprietorship model. Then things start to get more complex, right? Maybe you become corporation, maybe you take on outside capital in the form of debt, right? Getting a loan, or in the form of equity. We sell shares of stock to other people. And then in this case, when the ownership starts getting diversified and we have much more in terms of agency problems, right? Because I have one party, the manager, who's doing all the day-to-day stuff, and then I have one or, you know, more, possibly thousands of owners who are dispersed and they have very different self-interests now, right? Okay, so this is showing us we have the manager, he's working on behalf of these investors here, and these two parties both have their own sets of self-interests, right? And the manager knows much more about day-to-day operations than the investors, right? So there's information asymmetry. Whereas think about a company where there's thousands of investors, right? Their main insight into the company is things like listening to quarterly earnings calls and going and looking when the company files their financial statements, right? I can see a 10Q and a 10K, but they don't have a lot of insight into the CEO and CFO and what they're doing on a daily basis, right? So that causes this information asymmetry, which makes it easier for the manager to pursue his own self-interest rather than always working in the self-interest of the shareholders. Right? We also have this other element called moral hazards, which results from the fact that the manager's actions are not 100% observable. All right, so what are the best interests? So I talked about how these two parties have different self-interests, but what exactly are they? So investors are a much more straightforward set of interests, right? They want to maximize their return on investment. Right? They want to protect the investment value. They don't want the share price to be plummeting. They also want to protect the reputation of the company, reduce the litigation risk of the company, right? Because all those things would reduce the value of the company. Manager, on the other hand, right, his best interests are things like maximizing his personal wealth while minimizing his effort. Right? And we have to worry about things like, oh, is the manager going to use corporate assets for his own personal use, right? Is he going to use the company jet to take all his dates, out on the town? Manager also typically has a short-term focus. I think the average lifespan of a CEO and CFO is something like 5 years, right? So my horizon within this business as a CEO may just be like trying to maximize value for this 5 years, or even maximizing my option value for 5 years. And then once I get out of there, I don't really care, right? If I'm not an owner, I'm not really worried about the company after I leave. And these are some things we already talked about, right? Information asymmetry and the moral hazard problem. And agency costs is another good term to know. So those are costs that arise out of agency problems and costs that I incur to try to prevent agency problems. So some of these costs could be related to trying to monitor the manager, right? So we have things like internal control systems that could try to monitor the manager. They could be managerial incentives, like giving the manager a bonus if they're able to maximize various aspects of firm value. They could also be things like audit fees, right? So maybe I am paying an auditor to oversee the manager so that I don't have to worry as much, and those audit fees will be considered costs. So let's talk about, and some of this will be repetition, how we would solve agency problems, right? So one way to solve agency problems would be to have all businesses be sole proprietorships. Okay, so we know this is really not practical, especially if a company is like a gas station, sure. But if it then becomes a network of gas stations across the entire United States, yeah, it's going to be pretty difficult for one person to own that and one person to manage thousands of gas stations spread over the United States. What might be a more realistic solution? You could possibly have things like incentive contracts, right? And so something like stock options is kind of based on this idea that, hey, if we get this manager stock in the company, they also become an owner, right? So now they're not just a manager, they're an owner too. And so their interests should be much better aligned with the owners, right? They should care about things like trying to maximize long run firm value. And you also see things like bonuses, right? Like I try to give them a quarterly bonus if they make their earnings targets. Going back to our little visual here, investors can give these incentive contracts to managers to try to make them behave more like owners. In turn, managers need to produce something to give to the investors to show them they're doing their job. And so this is where financial statements come into play, right? Like if you're outside of the firm, how can you measure my performance? Well, the way you can measure my performance is how about every quarter I give you a set of financial statements and you can see the company's income, the company's expenses, right? All of the assets and liabilities. You can see how the company's doing in this report, and you can use that to judge me and see how good of a job I'm doing managing this company. Okay, so what's the problem with that? Well, the obvious problem is I'm providing financial statements to be right to help you monitor me, but I am creating those financial statements, and so I can, in theory, make them say whatever I want them to say, right? I can cook the books and show you I'm doing an awesome job. And if you're just looking at the financial statements, you have no way of knowing if they're true or not. So this is where our old friend or new friend for, because we're just starting class, our new friend, the independent auditor, comes into play, right? So the independent auditor can serve as an impartial third party, and they can come in and look at these financial reports that the manager is providing to the investors, and they can validate whether these reports are correct or not. Okay? And in theory, if I'm a good manager, I should be happy for an auditor to look at my financial statements, right? Because I have nothing to hide, and I want them to validate those financial statements so the investors know that I am doing a good job and reporting everything faithfully and truthfully. And principals, of course, like the auditor, because they like to know, hey, these financial statements we're getting aren't garbage, right? They're filled with good information about that we can use to measure the performance of the CEO or CFO.